From the first formal moments of his papacy, Pope Benedict deliberately sought to reach out to the Jewish community. On Sunday, April 24th, as part of his homily at the Mass inaugurating his ministry, the Pope specifically made mention of my brothers and sisters of the Jewish people, to whom we are joined by a great shared spiritual heritage, one rooted in God's irrevocable promises. 6 days later, his first formal correspondence as Pope was addressed to Elio Toaff, the venerable Chief Rabbi Emeritus of Rome, on the occasion of Rav Toaff's 90th birthday, in which Benedict recalled the memorable day in 1986 when Toaff had welcomed John Paul to the Synagogue of Rome. The 5.5 years of Pope Benedict's Petrine ministry have been marked both by some of the most hope-filled signs in Jewish-Christian relations, but also by some moments that have seemed, at least from the outside, to be ambiguous and confusing regarding the direction Catholic dialogue with Jews might take. Pope John Paul visited the Synagogue of Rome in 1986, but Pope Benedict, in his 5 years on the throne of Peter, has already visited 3 synagogues. First, as part of his World Youth Day trip to Cologne, Germany, and then, in April of 2008, part of his papal pilgrimage to the United States, the Pope visited Manhattan's East Park Synagogue. And on January 17th of this year, the Pope reprised John Paul's 1986 visit, traveling to meet Chief Rabbi Riccardo Di Segni as an honored guest of Rome's main synagogue. His journey, however, had been somewhat overshadowed by media coverage of the Vatican decision weeks earlier to further advance the cause for beatification of Pope Pius XII, the wartime pope whose record continues to be at the center of a potent debate among scholars. Some Jewish leaders called upon Rabbi Di Segni to withdraw his invitation, and indeed the president of the Roman Jewish community, Riccardo Pacifici, pulled no punches in his public address when the Pope arrived at the synagogue. The silence of Pius XII before the Shoah still causes pain, because something ought to have been done. Maybe it would not have stopped the death trains, but it would have sent a signal, a final word of comfort, of human solidarity to these brothers of ours transported to the ovens of Auschwitz. The audience was gratified when the Pope spoke clearly regarding the Holocaust. He spoke movingly of the hundreds of Roman Jews who were snatched from their homes before these very walls and who with tremendous brutality were killed in Auschwitz. How, said the Pope, could one ever forget their faces, their names, their tears, and their desperation? And then, in a gentle but pointed rejoinder to the critics of Pope Pius and his wartime actions, he added, and the Apostolic See itself provided assistance, often in a hidden and discreet way. The Pope made it clear that he was very aware of the fierceness of the debate, but that like a number of prominent Jews and Catholics, he believed that pious decisions had been misunderstood and sometimes misrepresented. In May of 2009, Benedict followed once again in Pope John Paul's pilgrim footsteps when he traveled to Israel, becoming only the third pope in 1950 years to return to the Holy Land. Like Pope John Paul, Benedict prayed at the Western Wall, mourned the victims of the Holocaust at Yad Vashem, and held meetings with Israeli religious and political leaders. He spoke of the need for ongoing vigilance in the face of a resurgent anti-Semitism, of the urgency of a much-hoped-for Israeli-Palestinian peace, and of the difficult situation of many Christians in the Holy Land. He emphasized the Church's commitment to a vigorous dialogue with Jews and Muslims, and referring to the tragedy of the Shoah, he said, "Those dark memories must strengthen our determination to draw closer to one another as branches on the same olive tree, nourished from the same roots and united in brotherly love." While it was a striking and historic visit, the fact that a papal trip to the Holy Land was becoming an expected part of the papacy simply confirmed the dramatic turnaround in Jewish-Catholic relations since the war. What once had been utterly unthinkable had now become, if not an everyday occurrence, at least a not entirely unusual one. Comparing the fact of 2 papal visits in 9 years versus no papal visits in 1950 years, speaks volumes about the growth and transformation of the bond between Jews and Catholics. Two other significant issues have caused hard feelings in the Catholic-Jewish relationship since 2005. First of all, Pope Benedict's decision to extend general permission for priests to celebrate the 1962 pre-Vatican II Latin Mass, which included the recitation of the less than interreligiously sensitive Good Friday prayer for the Jews, and his lifting of the excommunications levied against 3 bishops of the Schismatic Society of St. Pius X, founded by the late Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who protested against the liturgical and theological reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Both those gestures, intended to promote reconciliation with the Lefebvrist movement and bring them back to mainstream Catholicism, were viewed with confusion, scandal, and upset by many Jews and more than a few Catholics. Not only did the pre-Vatican II Good Friday prayer seem directly at odds with its 1970 successor, but many Lefebvrists publicly espoused long-rejected anti-Jewish stereotypes, arguments, and images. Indeed, as critics quickly pointed out, the British Lefebvrist Bishop Richard Williamson had made something of a reputation for himself by publicly minimizing the extent and the significance of the Holocaust. The Vatican's response to the outcry was to say the Pope had not been personally aware of Bishop Williamson's views and to reiterate that his opinions were utterly contrary to church teaching, such that the bishop could not be fully received into the church's sacramental life until he publicly renounced them, something that he has not yet done. The Pope himself composed a new Latin prayer for the Jews, which, although less harsh than the 1962 edition, was still criticized for speaking of the Jews as needing enlightenment and expressing what seemed to be a veiled hope that at the end of time all Jews would convert to Christianity. So what does the future hold for Jews and Catholics, and what issues will we need to address together in our relationship in the future? I think there are at least 4 that I would like to highlight with you this evening. Firstly, the repeated statements of both Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict emphasize that in the mind of the Catholic Church, the covenant established by God with the Jewish people remains in effect, unaltered and unalterable because of the very nature of God's own loving faithfulness. If that is indeed the case, as St. Paul stresses in the letter to the Romans, then important questions arise about the relationship of the Jewish covenant to the redemption offered to humanity in Jesus Christ as Son of God and Savior of the world. How do we relate that Jewish covenant to the Christian one? Should we speak of 2 covenants, or as Pope Benedict has written, of one covenant which takes 2 forms? Because our covenant relationship with God is at the heart of both faiths, we need to grapple with this question creatively and honestly without in any way compromising the central tenets of our 2 faiths. Do Catholics actively seek the conversion of Jews or not? That question has received a number of different answers in recent years from some of the most authoritative voices in my church, including a number of prominent cardinals. The fact that there does not seem to be a single, unequivocal answer causes some Jews to believe that behind the current friendship of the Catholic Church, there still lurks a darker, though disguised, attempt at proselytization under the cover of dialogue. In a community still profoundly scarred by the attempted destruction of European Jewry by the Nazis, any concerted institutional effort to promote missionary efforts among Jews, which from a Jewish perspective is traditionally categorized as apostasy and a betrayal of one's faith, is greeted with anger, resentment, and a sense that for some Christians, the only good Jew is a Jew who converts to Christianity. Does our faith allow theological space for Jews as Jews? Or is it the ultimate, though perhaps unspoken, desire of Catholicism that all Jews should ideally become Christian? As you can imagine, that suggestion sends shivers down the spine of many devout Jews who remember too well the centuries of coercive Christian attempts to convert Jews to faith in Jesus as Messiah. At a time when the integrity and sincerity of Catholic friendship with Jews is sometimes called into question, I believe it is imperative that we leave no ambiguity in this regard in official Catholic teaching. Whatever we believe should be made abundantly clear to our Jewish partners, who are then free to decide in an informed, mature way whether or not those are conditions under which they wish to dialogue with Christians. Whatever our faith's approach is, forthrightness demands that we state it upfront and candidly.